The ancient vow activated at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Rosalie Rosenfeld was already holding the vampire prince when it happened. She felt it first, as a burn low and spreading, somewhere beneath her sternum, as though someone had pressed a coal against the inside of her ribcage and held it there. The sensation crawled outward through her veins with the slow, deliberate patience of something that had waited centuries for this exact moment. She gasped. The man in her arms did not move, because the man in her arms was unconscious, bleeding from a wound along his temple where the silver lace blade had struck him, and his white hair was spread across her lap like something from a painting, pale and impossible and utterly inhuman. She had not meant to catch him. She had been running. That was the whole point. Rosalie Rosenfeld had spent the last 4 months running, and she was very good at it by now. She knew which rooftops to use to cross the lower quarter of the city without touching the streets that the Covenant's watchers monitored. She knew which underground transit tunnels still had blind spots in the camera coverage. She knew that vampires could not track scent through moving water, so she always kept a flask of river water in her coat to mask her trail when things got too close. What she had not known, had never been warned about, was that the old blood law called the vinculum could activate without a formal ceremony. She had not known that her blood, which she had spilled 2 months ago in the cathedral basement, when the Covenant's hunters had cornered her and she had cut her palm on a broken pew nail and gripped the iron railing to pull herself up, had mixed with a single drop of vampire blood already dried into that same railing. She had not known whose blood it had been. She knew now, because the vampire with his head in her lap opened silver-grey eyes, eyes the color of a winter sky, just before the first snowfall, and looked up at her with an expression she had never expected to see on a face, that regal, that sculpted, that ancient. He looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world. "You," Nikolai Gravesend said, and his voice was low and precise and carried the weight of someone who had not been surprised in approximately 3 centuries. "You are the girl who has been evading my court for 4 months. Your court has been trying to kill me for 4 months," Rosalie said, because she was not the kind of person who flinched from uncomfortable truths, even when the truth was staring at her from the lap of her coat. "There is a difference." His jaw tightened, even bleeding, even prone, even at a clear tactical disadvantage. The vampire prince managed to make the expression look like a deliberate choice rather than a concession. "The Covenant sent hunters, not my court. Your court did not stop them. I did not know about you," he said, and there was something in those words that sounded less like a defense and more like a wound. "Not until tonight." Then the burn inside her chest flared sharp and white, and Rosalie made a sound she was not proud of, something involuntary and small, and Nikolai Gravesend sat upright in one fluid motion, despite the blood on his temple, and the silver still working its way out of the cut, and he gripped her wrist with fingers that were cool and absolutely certain. "What is that?" she'd demanded. "That," he said, very carefully, "is the vinculum." She stared at him. The blood vow. The ancient blood vow. He turned her wrist over, and she could see it now, barely. A fine tracery of silver-violet lines just beneath the skin running from her inner wrist toward the bend of her elbow, branching like frost patterns on glass. "The oldest covenant my bloodline carries. It has not activated in 400 years. Tell me what it does," she said, because Rosalie Rosenfeld had learned very early in her life that information was the only armor that actually held. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze, And neither of them looked away. "It binds a human under the protection of the Gravesend line," he said at last. "Permanently, irrevocably, without exception. Blood law supersedes all covenant jurisdiction. From the moment of activation, any attempt to harm you is an act of war against my house." A pause. "It also means that I am bound to you in ways that I will need to explain carefully, and that you have every right to be furious about." "Start talking," Rosalie said, "because we are currently in an alley that the Covenant's Eastern Patrol covers every 20 minutes, and you are bleeding silver. And I am lit up like a brand under my skin. So whatever explanation you have, you had better make it fast." He almost smiled. Just almost. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, a ghost of it. And then his eyes swept the alley with the fast, comprehensive scan of someone who had survived court politics for centuries, and he stood with a speed and grace that made her breath catch despite everything. "Come with me," he said, and extended his hand, and his voice held a quality she had heard in very few people over her 23 years of life. It was not a command, it was not a plea, it was an offering, deliberate and full weight, from someone who understood exactly what he was asking, and was asking it anyway. She took his hand. She told herself it was tactical. She was already not sure she believed herself. Rosalie Rosenfeld had not been born into the world of vampire courts and blood laws. She had been born in a regular hospital in Chicago to a human mother and a human father, both of whom had been wonderful and ordinary, and completely unaware that the apartment building they lived in sat 3 blocks from one of the oldest Covenant substations in the Midwest. She had grown up reading too many books and arguing with her teachers, and developing a talent for noticing things that other people missed, patterns in data, inconsistencies in stories, the small tells that revealed when someone was lying versus when they genuinely believed the wrong thing. She had discovered the vampire world the way most humans discovered things that changed their lives entirely, by accident, at the absolute worst possible time, under circumstances that left her with no good options. She had been 22 and working as a research assistant at a private archive that specialized in occult manuscripts when she had found the file. Not a manuscript, a file, a very modern, very current, very damning file that detailed the Covenant's practice of trafficking certain humans, ones who carried what the documents called the resonant gene, a rare marker that made their blood uniquely compatible with elder vampire consumption, into vampire courts without consent, without documentation, without any of the protections that the secret treaty between the human government's deep supernatural division and the vampire covenant was supposed to guarantee. She had made copies. She had run. The covenant had sent hunters. 4 months later, she was holding a vampire prince's bleeding head in her lap in a Chicago alley, and the universe had apparently decided that was an appropriate narrative pivot. Nikolai moved through the city with a certainty that made the streets feel like his personal domain, which she was beginning to suspect they essentially were. He wore a long dark coat over a charcoal shirt, no tie. Cuffs rolled back to reveal forearms that were pale as marble and marked with faint old scarring she recognized instinctively as silver burns, the kind that healed imperfectly even on vampire flesh. His white hair was pulled back with a discipline that suggested habit rather than vanity. He was tall, wide-shouldered, built like someone who had spent centuries understanding how to be both beautiful and dangerous without choosing between them. He brought her to a door she had walked past at least a dozen times in the last 4 months, a plain steel door set into the side of a building, that housed a parking structure and 3 floors of storage units. He pressed his palm to the steel, and she felt, rather than heard, a deep resonance from below, like a tuning fork, struck at a frequency meant for bones rather than ears. The door opened inward. The stairs beyond it descended for 2 full floors, before opening into something that made Rosalie stop moving entirely for approximately 3 seconds, which was the longest she ever allowed herself to stand still in an unfamiliar space. The court of House Gravesend beneath the city was not what she had imagined a vampire court would look like. She had expected darkness, red velvet, dramatic candlelight, the theatrical excess that the Covenant's propaganda materials used when they wanted to make vampires look like a manageable, contained threat with predictable aesthetics. What she got instead was a space of cold, clean architectural precision, all dark stone and high ceilings, and the kind of lighting that was dim but comprehensive. No harsh shadows, nothing hidden by design. The furniture was old, genuinely old in a way that antiques dealers would have wept over, but it was not cluttered. The walls held maps, not decorative maps. Working maps covered in notations in at least 4 languages, 2 of which she recognized, and 2 of which she was certain were not any human tongue. There were vampires in the room, 4 of them, and they all looked at her the way she imagined a room full of centuries-old predators would look at a human who had just walked in uninvited, with complete, flat, immediate attention. "Stand down," Nikolai said, and there was no raise in his volume, no effort in it at all. But every vampire in the room rearranged their posture within the same breath. "My lord," said a vampire woman near the central table, tall and sharp-featured, with white hair cropped close at the sides and longer on top, silver eyes that catalogued Rosalie in about a second and a half. "The girl is carrying the vinculum mark. I can see that, Seraphine. Does she understand what it means?" "She is standing right here," Rosalie said, "and she is capable of asking her own questions." The vampire woman, Seraphine, looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite approval, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "I see," she said. "Rosalie?" Nikolai said, and she noticed that he had used her name without being told it, which she filed away under things to address. Later, "This is Seraphine, my second. She is not a threat to you. No one in this court is a threat to you. The vinculum has activated, and blood law is absolute in this house. I appreciate the reassurance," Rosalie said, "but I would appreciate the explanation more." He gestured toward a chair at the table. She sat because sitting gave her the desk surface to put her hands on and the angle to watch the room. He sat across from her, not at the head of the table, directly across, and she understood that this was deliberate. "The vinculum," he said, "is a founding vow of House Gravesend. 380 years ago, my ancestor Valderic Gravesend made a covenant with a human woman named Mira, who saved his life when the old covenant tried to execute him during the purges. He swore that his bloodline would protect any human whose blood resonated with his line's mark, without condition, without demand, without the human's freedom being compromised." He paused. It was his way of ensuring that the debt was repaid forward, endlessly, for as long as the house stood. Rosalie looked at the marks on her wrist, and the human gets no say in whether it activates. No. And he said this without deflection, without qualifying it, which she respected, even as it infuriated her. The activation is involuntary. The protection is involuntary. What happens after is not. What does that mean? "It means," he said, and for the first time she heard something careful and human in his centuries-old voice. that you are protected whether you want to be or not. But how you live within that protection, whether you stay, whether you leave, whether you choose to engage with this court, or simply want us to hold a perimeter around your life while you pretend we do not exist, all of that is your choice. I will not cage you. That is not what the vow is. She studied him for a long moment. The silver burn on his temple had almost closed. Vampire healing was extraordinary in the abstract and somehow more extraordinary as an immediate visual fact. "The file I have," she said. "The covenant trafficking documentation. I know about it," he said. She sat very still. "How long have you known?" 3 weeks. He held her gaze without flinching. "I did not know you had it specifically. I knew it existed. I have been building a case against the Covenant's Eastern operations for 9 months. What you found is part of a pattern I have been tracing through 4 different courts and 2 human government divisions. You stumbled into the middle of an operation I have been running in silence because the moment the Covenant knows I am moving against them, they will trigger contingencies that will kill the humans in that pipeline before I can extract them." She let the silence sit for a moment. Outside, above them, the city breathed and hummed with the weight of its ordinary human life, none of it aware that below, in a room built from old stone and older purpose, a human woman who had been running for 4 months was making a decision that she could feel changing the shape of her future even as she sat there. "Show me your evidence," she said. "Rosalie, show me your evidence," she repeated, "and I will show you mine, and we will figure out whether they match up, and if they do, we will talk about what comes next. That is how this works. I do not surrender my autonomy to a blood law I did not consent to. But I am also not so stupid enough to run from an alliance that could actually solve the problem I have been trying to solve alone for 4 months. Nikolai Gravesend looked at her across that old table with those winter sky eyes, and she saw something move through his expression that she did not have a name for yet, but that she recognized instinctively as significant. "Very well," he said, and nodded to Seraphine, who moved to a panel in the wall that opened to reveal a security room whose display screens lit the space with the cold blue of gathered intelligence. They worked through the night. It was the strangest night of Rosalie's life, which was saying something given the previous 4 months. She sat at Nikolai's table with her copies of the Covenant files spread against his intelligence maps, and she watched the way he thought, fast, lateral, never linear, always 3 steps ahead, and then doubling back to find the load-bearing assumption. He had 3 centuries of political strategy behind him, and she had a research background that had trained her to find patterns in chaos, and the combination was, she had to admit, extremely effective. By 3 in the morning, they had identified 17 points of operational overlap between her evidence and his. By 4, they had a timeline. By 5, they had the shape of something that could actually work. At some point, Seraphine had left and come back with coffee, real coffee, which Rosalie found both incongruous and deeply appreciated, and, when she looked up to say so, she found Nikolai watching her with an expression of focused attention that made her stomach do something inconvenient and complex. "You drink coffee in your court," she said, because addressing the stomach situation directly was not on tonight's agenda. "Some of the humans who work with us appreciate it," he said. "I find the smell useful." "Useful how?" "It is grounding," he said, after a pause that suggested he had not entirely meant to answer that honestly. "The modern world moves quickly. Things that smell like they have always smelled are grounding." She looked at him for a moment, Then she looked back at her papers. How old are you? 312. Do you remember what the world looked like before any of this? I remember a great deal, he said. What is it you actually want to know? She looked up again. I want to know why a vampire prince who has been running a covert intelligence operation for 9 months needed me to be the one who told him the shape of it tonight. I did not need you to tell me the shape of it, he said. I had the shape. What you gave me tonight is the proof that will hold in court, the kind that can be presented to the human deep division and the Covenant's oversight body simultaneously, without either of them being able to dismiss it as intercourt manipulation. You are a human researcher with no prior connection to any vampire house. You found this evidence through legitimate channels. That is not a small thing. You are saying, I am useful. I am saying, he said carefully, that you are necessary. There is a difference. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the city beginning its early morning shift, the sounds changing from night traffic to the first delivery vehicles. I have been living out of a go-bag for 4 months, she said, not quite looking at him. 3 different apartments, 2 different names, one very patient friend in Portland, who has been holding my actual belongings since October. I know. At her sharp look, he said, not because I was tracking you, the vinculum mark. Once it activates, I have a limited sense of your safety, proximity, and distress level. I could tell you were running. I could tell you were afraid. I could not locate you specifically, which is why you were able to evade the court, but I knew the emotional signature. She absorbed this. That is an extraordinary invasion of privacy. Yes, he said. It is. You agree with that? Of course I agree with it. I am not going to perform comfort about an uncomfortable truth. He looked at her steadily. The vow was made with good intentions. The experience of being on the receiving end of it, without consent, is a different matter, and I will not pretend otherwise to make myself more palatable to you. Rosalie Rosenfeld had met a great many people in her 23 years who were unwilling to admit the complications inherent in their own power. She found that she had no immediate response to someone who did it without prompting. She went back to the files. She told herself this was the most pressing matter. The Covenant moved faster than Nikolai had expected them to. The intelligence came in at noon through a source inside the Eastern Division, and it was not good. The Covenant had somehow gotten ahead of the timeline, not the full scope of operation, but enough. They knew the evidence existed. They knew someone connected to House Gravesend had it, and they were moving to trigger the contingency that Nikolai had been afraid of, the silent transfer of the pipeline's current human captives out of the known holding facilities and into locations that the intelligence maps had not yet identified. Rosalie learned all of this standing in the middle of Nikolai's operations room, while Seraphine laid out the intercepts on the main screen, and the room filled with the particular tense silence of people who understand that they are about to run out of time. How many people? Rosalie. 11, Seraphine said. That we can confirm. Possibly more. When do they move them? 48 hours. If that. Rosalie looked at the map. She looked at the facility locations, 3 of them, spread across the city's outer districts. She looked at the Covenant's known patrol patterns, which she had been observing, from necessity, for months. I know the Eastern facility, she said. Everyone in the room looked at her. I spent 6 weeks in the district around it before I understood what it was, she said. I mapped the patrol rotations as a survival measure. I did not know what I was mapping at the time. I know I have the information somewhere. She turned to Nikolai. Give me access to your mapping interface and 30 minutes. He did not hesitate. Seraphine, the 30-minute became 45, but what she produced was thorough, and she knew it was thorough, because Nikolai went through it with the focus of someone who was not performing validation, who was actually checking it against his own operational knowledge and finding it solid. He caught two things she had missed, both related to vampire-specific patrol capabilities she had not known about. She updated the map without ego, and he offered the corrections without condescension, and afterward, Seraphine looked between them with an expression that Rosalie could not quite interpret. "This is workable," Nikolai said, and there was something in his voice that sounded less like a professional assessment and more like relief. For the eastern facility, the northern and western are different approaches. I am not suggesting I handle all three, Rosalie said. I am suggesting that for the eastern, you have better intelligence with me in the field than without me. The room went very quiet. Absolute not, Nikolai said. His voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It did not need to. The word carried 3 centuries of absolute certainty. I understand the instinct, Rosalie said, equally calm. I am also telling you that I spent 4 months surviving in this city, with the Covenant actively hunting me, that I know the Eastern District better than anyone currently in this room, and that the vinculum mark you keep mentioning apparently gives you a real-time distress signal on my condition, which is more tracking capability than you have on any of your own operatives. Silence. She is not wrong, Seraphine said, and then looked at Nikolai with an expression that somehow communicated both loyalty and the specific willingness to say difficult things that a good second-in-command requires. Nikolai looked at Rosalie. She had the impression of someone running calculations at a speed that human thought did not quite reach, and beneath the calculation, something else, something that was not calculation at all, and that she could feel as a faint echo in the vinculum marks on her wrist. You stay with me, he said, at every point. You do not go ahead. You do not go independently. You do not make unilateral decisions in the field without communicating them to me first. Agreed, she said, with the reciprocal condition that you communicate your decisions to me rather than issuing directives and expecting compliance. Another silence. Agreed, he said. The operation was planned for that night. The 48-hour window the Covenant had given them was, as intelligence windows often were, probably optimistic. They moved on the assumption they had 36, and planned for 30, the hours before the operation had a quality that Rosalie recognized from her months of running, that suspended time feeling of waiting, that was not quite calm and not quite fear, but something in between that made thought run very clearly and made the edges of things seem precise. She sat in a small room Seraphine had shown her to, a room with a cot and a lamp and a window that looked out onto the underground court's narrow interior garden, where something dark-leafed and determined was growing in the artificial light. She was reviewing the operation plan for the 4th time when the door opened. Nikolai stood in the doorway. He was wearing operational gear now, close-fitting dark clothing, and he was holding 2 cups of coffee with the slightly careful manner of someone not entirely sure this was the right impulse to act on. She took one. Thank you. He remained in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat in the chair by the window, and they were quiet together with the map plans on the table between them. You said, she began, and then stopped and reorganized. When you described the vinculum, you said you were bound to me. You said you needed to explain it carefully, and that I had every right to be furious. Yes. You explained the protection aspect. You did not explain what being bound to me means from your side. He was quiet for a moment. The underground garden's artificial light cast something gentle across the sharp lines of his face, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was very beautiful in the way that dangerous things were beautiful. The way lightning was beautiful, undeniable, and not safe to look at too long. The vinculum creates a directional awareness, he said. I told you that, but it also creates an orientation. For a Gravesend, once the vow has activated, and the bound human becomes someone whose well-being matters in a way that is not rational, and is not temporary, and is not subject to political consideration. He paused. It means that your safety is not a strategic priority for me. It is a foundational one. The strategy exists to serve it, not the other way around. That sounds like it could become a very significant tactical vulnerability, she said carefully. It is, he said. I am not going to pretend otherwise. It also means that I cannot be leveraged against you, because there is no offer, no threat, no negotiated exchange that supersedes it, which cuts both ways. She looked at her coffee. Nikolai. It was the first time she had used his name without it being embedded in an argument or a question, and she heard herself do it and did not take it back. Yes, he said quietly. What happens to you if something happens to me? He did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. The last time the vinculum activated, he said, was with Valderic himself. Mira died. Old age. He stayed with her until the end, and then he went into voluntary stasis for 40 years because he did not trust himself without the anchor of her presence. You are telling me you would be genuinely destabilized. I am telling you, he said, and she heard the specific precision of someone choosing honesty over comfort. That I will not let that happen. They looked at each other across the small table in the underground room, and the vinculum marks on her wrist gave off a warmth that was not unpleasant, and she thought about what it would mean to be truly protected for the first time in years, and she thought about what it cost him to say that with such complete simplicity, and she thought that the universe had made a very complicated and very unexpected choice when it had decided to activate an ancient blood vow in a Chicago alley on a Tuesday night. We should sleep, she said, because she was 23 and she had been running for 4 months, and tomorrow she was going into a covenant facility, and she was not going to fall into something she did not fully understand on the eve of an operation that required her to be clear-headed. Yes, he said, and stood, and set his coffee cup down with the measured grace of someone who has had 3 centuries to learn how to leave a room at exactly the right moment. At the door he paused. Rosalie, he said, for what it is worth, you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a very long time, and I have had a very long time. He left. She sat with that for approximately 4 minutes before she was able to go back to the map. The Eastern Covenant facility was set inside a converted industrial warehouse in a district that the city used for overflow storage and light manufacturing, the kind of neighborhood that was busy in the daytime and largely empty after 8 at night. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from the adjacent structures. From the inside, according to Nikolai's intelligence, combined with Rosalie's patrol maps, it held 3 floors of secured holding space, a communications hub, and a rotating guard of 6 Covenant operatives on the overnight shift, 2 of whom were vampire, 4 of whom were human Covenant enforcers. They went in at 2 in the morning. Nikolai moved differently in the field than he did in the court. In the court he was contained, precise, gravity-steady. In the field he was something else, faster than she could fully process. Fluid in the way that predators were fluid, entirely without the small hesitations that marked human movement. He was also, she noted with a clarity that she attributed to operational focus, and not anything more complicated, extraordinary to move alongside. He communicated with gesture and glance, and the occasional word spoken below normal hearing, and she found that she understood him with a completeness that she suspected was partially the vinculum and partially something simpler and older. She had given him the patrol gap window. It held. They moved through the eastern entrance during the 3-minute shift rotation blind spot she had mapped in her 6 weeks in the district, and then Nikolai dealt with the 2 internal guards with an efficiency she was grateful. She did not have to look away from, because it was not lethal, it was specific and controlled. And she filed that away as well. The holding cells were on the 2nd floor. The 11 people inside them were in various states of awareness, all of them resonant gene carriers, all of them brought in through the Covenant's trafficking network. And Rosalie thought of the file she had found, which was no longer abstract when the people in it were right in front of her. She and Seraphine had worked out an extraction sequence that prioritized the individuals with the least mobility. Nikolai stayed at the cell block entrance, and she moved through the cells with the key sequence they had extracted from the intelligence, and she spoke to each person's in a level voice, and told them who she was, and that they were leaving, and that they were safe. An older man, seated against the far wall of the last cell, looked at her with the exhausted wariness of someone who had stopped trusting, offered safety, and she understood that completely. "My name is Rosalie Rosenfeld," she said. "I found the Covenant file in October. I have been running since then. The vampire prince outside this door has been building a case against this operation for 9 months. We are not here to move you somewhere else. We are here to get you out." She held out her hand. "But you do not have to take it if you do not want to." He looked at her hand for a long moment. Then he took it. She had 12 people moving through the corridor when the Covenant's early alarm triggered, and the operational plan became, as operational plans frequently do under real-world conditions, a great deal more complicated than the version on paper. What she remembered afterward, in order: the alarm, which was a low pulse frequency that disoriented human nervous systems, Nikolai's voice saying her name, sharp and immediate, the vinculum marks flaring with a heat that was directional. She turned toward it without thinking, and he was already there, between her and the Covenant enforcer, who had come from the stairwell she had not expected to be in use at this hour. And she saw what Nikolai Gravesend looked like when he was not containing himself for a room full of humans he was trying not to frighten. He was extraordinary and terrifying, and she felt absurdly, completely safe. The enforcer went down, not dead, incapacitated, carefully, with the controlled violence of someone who was doing the minimum required and nothing extra. Nikolai turned to her immediately, both hands moving to her face for one brief moment, cataloguing her condition with his eyes, and the expression on his face when he found her unharmed was something she was going to think about for a long time. "Move," he said, and she moved, and he moved with her, and they brought 12 people out of the eastern facility and into the night. The northern and western operations ran simultaneously, with 2 of Nikolai's court operatives leading. Both were successful. By 4 in the morning, 23 humans were in the temporary safety of 3 different locations that the court had prepared, and Rosalie was sitting on a loading dock 2 blocks from the eastern facility, watching the city go about its oblivious business. While the adrenaline finished working its way out of her system, Nikolai sat next to her, not nearby. Their shoulders were almost touching. 23, she said. 23, he confirmed. The Covenant is going to move against your house now. Yes. You were building to this anyway. Yes, but the timeline has accelerated. He was quiet for a moment. The evidence package will go to the Deep Division and the Oversight Body simultaneously in 6 hours. Seraphine is preparing it now. With your documentation included, it is airtight, and the Covenant's response will be political at first. They will not move against the House directly, not immediately. They have too much to lose in an open confrontation. He paused. There will be attempts to isolate me, to find leverage. His gaze moved to her. You will be identified as that leverage. She met his gaze. I figured I will not let them use you that way. I know, she said, and she found that she meant it, that it was not reassurance she was offering, but genuine knowledge. Something she had accumulated over the last 24 hours that had the solid, specific weight of evidence. I also know how to make myself a very difficult target. 4 months of practice. You will not have to do it alone this time. She looked at him. The dock's security light was not flattering to anyone, but Nikolai Gravesend managed to look timeless in it, which was probably not something a person could learn, and was just what 3 centuries of very good bone structure produced. When you said I was the most remarkable person you had encountered in a long time, she said, were you being diplomatic? I do not do diplomatic, he said, with a flatness that was itself the answer. I have had 3 centuries to observe that diplomatic is a form of slow dishonesty, and I find it tedious. Then, what did you mean by it? He looked at her with the full weight of those winter sky eyes, and she felt the vinculum marks pulse once, warm and steady. And she thought that whatever the ancient vow was or was not, it was at minimum a very honest thing. I meant, he said, that you are frightening and brilliant, and you walked into a room full of vampires with a go bag and 4 months of survival instinct and sat down at the table and made yourself equal to it in about 10 minutes. I meant that you argued with me about operational inclusion and were entirely correct to do so. I meant that you held an old man's hand in a dark cell and made him feel like the offer was genuinely his to refuse. He paused. I meant all of it. Rosalie Rosenfeld was not the kind of person who cried in operational contexts. She was not the kind of person who cried particularly often in general, but she was also 23, and she had been alone and afraid for 4 months, and the weight of it had been something she had carried very carefully and very quietly, and something about the precise and complete honesty of what he had just said moved through that careful weight in a way that she felt in her chest. I need you to know, she said, that I am not someone who transfers my autonomy to anyone, including blood vows, including vampire princes. I know that. And I need you to know that whatever this is, I am not going to pretend it is not happening just because it is inconvenient and complicated and happened in an alley when I was not expecting it. He went very still. What is happening? He said carefully. In your assessment? She looked at him. I think you know what is happening. I would prefer to hear you say it. She leaned forward the small distance that was required and kissed him, and he was perfectly still for approximately 1 second, and then he was not still at all, and his hand came up to her face with a gentleness that was remarkable from someone who had just taken down a covenant enforcer with one motion. And she thought that the combination of those two things, the gentleness and the capability, was probably going to be her complete undoing. When she pulled back, his expression was not the composed, controlled face of the vampire prince. It was something much more immediate than that, something that, despite 3 centuries, looked exactly like wonder. "Rosalie?" he said. "Yes," she said, anticipating the question. "I have not," he started again, with the careful precision of someone used to being exact. "The vinculum creates orientation, I told you that. What I did not tell you is that it does not create feeling, it creates the conditions, for feeling itself is the person's own." She looked at him. "You are telling me that you are in love with me, independently of the blood vow." "I am telling you," he said, "that I have been aware of you for 24 hours, and that something that feels very much like the beginning of that is happening in a way that has nothing to do with Valderic's covenant, and that it is somewhat alarming and also the least alarming thing that has happened today." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, coming out with the whole weight of the last 4 months behind it, and the specific relief of the last 24 hours, and the warmth of the vinculum marks on her wrist, and the extraordinary situation of sitting on a loading dock at 4 in the morning, with a 300 at her like she was the least expected and most significant thing he had encountered in 3 centuries. He looked at her laugh the way he looked at things he wanted to understand fully. "We should go back," she said, when she had recovered. "There is still a covenant crisis to manage." "Yes," he said, "there is." He stood and offered his hand, and she took it, and they walked back through the pre-dawn city together, and his hand was cool and certain around hers, and she was not running anymore. The political fallout from the evidence release was, as Nikolai had predicted, immediate and significant. The Covenant's Eastern leadership attempted 3 different deflection strategies in the first 48 hours, all of which Rosalie helped Nikolai's team prepare counter-documentation for. Sitting in the operations room with coffee and her laptop, and the particular focused energy of someone who was finally fighting back with real tools instead of just surviving. The Deep Division's supernatural liaison came to the court, personally, a human official named Hargrove, who looked like someone who had spent 20 years carefully not being surprised by anything, and he reviewed the evidence with Rosalie for 3 hours and then told her, with the specific gravity of bureaucratic understatement, that the documentation was the most complete they had seen in a decade of monitoring Covenant operations. "The resonant gene trafficking program will be shut down," he told her. "Full oversight review of the Eastern Division. 3 senior Covenant officials are already facing tribunal." Rosalie received this with the steadiness of someone who had spent 4 months holding on to the fact that the file mattered, that it was worth running for, that the people in those holding cells were real. She did not cry. She did come very close. Afterward, Nikolai found her in the underground garden, where she had gone to be quiet for a few minutes. The dark-leafed plants were doing very well in their artificial light, and she had discovered over the previous days that they were a kind of deep-rooted nightshade that Seraphine cultivated, which was both very specific and very appropriate. He stood beside her, and they were quiet together, which she had discovered was something they did well. The 2 of them, quiet together, without it feeling like absence. "The tribunal will take months," he said. "I know, The Covenant will attempt to rebuild. Different channels, different methods. I know that too. She turned to look at him. Are you trying to tell me the work is not finished? I am trying to tell you, he said, that this house intends to continue the work, and that the question of where you are during that continuation is one I want to discuss with you directly, rather than assume. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, the nightshade moved in the ventilation current. Above them, the city lived its unknowing life. Somewhere upstairs, Seraphine was running down the next phase of the intelligence operation, and the court was humming with suspicion energy of people who had been in the right of something difficult and knew it. You are asking me to stay, she said. I am asking whether you want to, he said. There is a difference. She smiled, and she saw what it did to his expression when she did, the way something settled in him, like a thing that had been held carefully at tension being allowed to rest. I want to, she said. I have conditions. I expected nothing less. I want a real role, not protected guest, operational researcher, full access to the intelligence work, decisions made jointly rather than handed to me after the fact. Agreed. I want to bring my friend in Portland in from the cold. She has been holding my things, and she deserves to know I am alive and not in danger anymore. I will have a secure line arranged today, and I want the room with the window that looks at the garden. He looked at her. That is my room. She held his gaze. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, the ghost of a smile that she had been cataloguing appeared, and this time it became something complete and real, and it changed his face entirely, made him look for a moment like something closer to the 312 years he had lived, rather than the contained, timeless figure he maintained for the court. And she thought that it was perhaps the most valuable thing she had seen in all of this. The room with the window, he said, has 2 occupants going forward, it appears. That is the general idea, she confirmed. He reached out and touched the vinculum marks on her inner wrist, tracing the silver-violet lines with one cool fingertip, and the warmth that moved through them at his touch was different from the activation burn, softer and more deliberate, like something that had been waiting to become this. Rosalie, he said. Nikolai, she said back, and heard the smile in her own voice. When the vow activated, he said, I was in the middle of a formal court meeting with 3 other houses and 2 Covenant representatives. I dismissed all of them inside of 30 seconds and came looking for you. She blinked. You did not tell me that. I was managing my own reaction, he said. 3 centuries of composure and a blood vow, sending the emotional signature of a human in distress, managed to comprehensively override it. A pause. My second political advisor has still not forgiven me for the abruptness. She laughed again, and this time he laughed too, brief and warm and real. And she stored the sound of it somewhere she intended to keep. The weeks that followed were not quiet. The Covenant's response to the tribunal evolved through 3 distinct phases, each of which required the court to respond with precision, and Rosalie was in the operations room for all of it, building documentation structures and cross-referencing intelligence with a focus that Nikolai's team had adapted to with a speed that said something good about them. Seraphine, who had begun by cataloguing Rosalie with cool professional assessment, shifted somewhere around the end of the 2nd week into something that was almost within the precise emotional vocabulary of a centuries-old vampire operative, warmth. You are building a filing system, Seraphine said one morning, watching Rosalie reorganize the intelligence archive. Your previous system was organized by date of acquisition, Rosalie said. "That is fine for retrieval, but useless for pattern analysis. I am reorganizing by subject intersection." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Nikolai has been waiting for someone to do this for approximately 40 years. Then he should have hired a researcher. "He tried," Seraphine said. "They were always either too intimidated by the court to work effectively or not capable enough to handle the material. You are neither." "Because I was already terrified of something much more immediate when I arrived," Rosalie said. So the intimidation window had passed. Seraphine's expression shifted into something definitive and complete. "I like you," she said, as though this was information she was delivering rather than sentiment she was expressing. "I want that noted," Rosalie said. Nikolai appeared in the doorway. He had been in meetings with 2 other Vampire House representatives for the last 3 hours, managing the political realignment that the Covenant collapse was triggering, and he looked like someone who had maintained composure for an extended period and was putting it down now that he was back in his own space. His gaze found Rosalie the moment he entered the room, the specific immediate focus of the vinculum orientation, and she had stopped trying to pretend she did not notice it, and started instead feeling something warm and steady every time it happened. "How did the meeting go?" she said. "House Valdris is going to be difficult," he said, crossing to her directly. "Their position on the resonant gene protection clause is obstructive. They see any formal protection as a precedent for human interference in court politics. That is a position held by someone who benefits from the current power imbalance," Rosalie said. "What are their actual reasons underneath the position?" He looked at her. "They are afraid that formalizing human protection means formalizing human standing in court proceedings, which eventually means human testimony carries weight in vampire tribunals." "Does that frighten you?" "No," he said, without hesitation. "It should have been the case 300 years ago." She nodded. "Then that is your argument with Valdris, not the formal position, the actual fear. Address the fear directly and the position becomes negotiable." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him turning it over. "Yes," he said, "that is right." Seraphine made a small sound that was probably the closest she came to expressing amusement. "The archive reorganization," Nikolai said, looking at the structure Rosalie had built. "This is going to take the retrieval time for cross-referenced intelligence from hours to minutes." "That was the goal," she said. He looked at her with that full-weight attention. "I want to do something for you," he said. "Not as the vow, as myself. You have been here for 3 weeks working at the same pace you ran at for 4 months, and you have not stopped." She tilted her head. "What did you have in mind?" "There is a place," he said, "above ground, outside the city. The house maintains a property in the hills. Old stone, good light, a library that has not been properly used in a century, a pause. I would like to take you there for a few days. The work will continue. Seraphine runs operations with an efficiency I cannot match. But I think we have not yet had the opportunity to simply be in each other's company without a crisis requiring our attention." She looked at him. The silver burn on his temple had fully healed. He was standing in her reorganized archive with his court coat still on from 3 hours of difficult political meetings, and his white hair slightly less contained than usual, and he was asking her to go somewhere quiet with him with the careful and open vulnerability of someone who had lived 3 centuries and had not often permitted himself to want something simply because he wanted it. "Yes," she said, "the property in the hills was everything he had described, and considerably more. Old stone house, north-facing rooms with the diffused light that was comfortable for vampire occupation, a library that ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls of a room that smelled like old pepper and wood smoke, and the specific, settled silence of a space that was full of accumulated knowledge and time. The November hills were bare and silver in the daylight, and the air was cold and completely clean, and Rosalie stood at the window of the library on the first morning and thought that she had not felt this kind of peace in a very long time. Nikolai brought her tea. This was, she had discovered, a habit he had developed some time in the 18th century and maintained with a regularity that was both practical and, she thought, something else. He brought her tea and sat across from her in one of the deep chairs by the window, and they read, not separately, but in the particular, companionable way of 2 people who are comfortable enough in each other's presence to be quiet without it being distance. She asked him about the books. He told her. He had been accumulating them across 3 centuries, some purchased, some received from courts, some from humans he had known. And she could trace the shape of his history through the collection in a way that was more intimate than any formal account he could have given her. She found a first edition that made her breath catch, and he watched her face when she opened it with an expression that she had begun to recognize as the one he wore when something mattered to him. On the second night they walked in the grounds after dark, the hills silver under a clear sky, and he told her about Valderic and Mira, the real story rather than the court history, the small human details that had not made it into the official record, the way Mira had argued with Valderic about everything, the way Valderic had been a different person in her presence than in the court, less defended, more alive, the way they had spent 40 years building something entirely their own between the demands of the vampire world and the brevity of a human life, not ignoring the difference in their natures, but working around it with the practical creativity of people who were committed to each other. He grieved her for 40 years, Rosalie said. Yes, but he also had 40 years with her, he always said. Nikolai told her that the 40 years were worth any price, that knowing her was worth every complication. He used to say that the court would have made him stone without her. She looked at the sky. "You are telling me something," she said. "I am," he agreed, "about us. About the fact that the difference between us, your mortality, my lack of it, is something I have thought about since the night you walked into the court, and I want to have that conversation with you rather than around it." She looked at him. "You are worried about outliving me. I am certain that I would outlive you if we did not address it." He met her eyes. "But there are ways within vampire law to address it, not simply. Not without your full understanding of what it entails, but they exist." She absorbed this with the thoughtful directness that was her natural mode. "Are you asking me to consider becoming a vampire? I am telling you the option exists, and that the conversation is yours to initiate or not, whenever and if ever you choose. I will not raise it as a pressure point. I will not make it conditional. I want you to know it is available, because I think you deserve full information, and then I want you to set it aside until and unless you want to return to it." She looked at him for a long moment, at this person who was 3 centuries old and stood in silver hill light with the contained grace of his nature and the open care of someone who had decided to let her see him clearly. And she thought about the ancient vow and the alley and the 24 hours that had changed everything, and the weeks since. And she thought about what it would mean to have a life that did not end too soon for the thing that was building between them. "I will think about it," she said. Genuinely, not as deflection. I know, he said. That is enough. She reached out and took his hand, and they stood in the hills above the city in the cold, clear night, and the vinculum marks on her wrist were warm and steady, and she thought about all the things she had been running from, and how far she had travelled to arrive at this exact piece of ground. And she found that she was entirely at peace with where she stood. He turned to her, and the moonlight made his white hair silver, and his eyes were that winter sky grey. And he raised her hand and pressed his lips to the vinculum marks on her inner wrist with a reverence that was not the cold formality of a court gesture, but something warm and personal and entirely his own. And she felt it in her chest, like the activation of something that had been waiting its whole existence for this moment. Rosalie, he said against her wrist, and her name in his voice had 300 years' precision, and one very new and very genuine warmth in it. Nikolai, she said, and stepped close to him. And he put his arms around her with the careful and absolute steadiness of someone who intended to hold on. The return to the city came with the resolution of the Covenant Tribunal, which concluded in the 4th month after the evidence release with a formal ruling that dismantled the Eastern trafficking operation, imposed oversight structures that gave the Deep Division real enforcement power, and established a protected status designation for resonant gene carriers that could not be revoked by any single Covenant division. Rosalie sat in the court with Nikolai when the ruling came through, and Seraphine brought champagne, which was an extraordinarily human gesture that she suspected Seraphine had planned specifically for its humanity, and the court of House Gravesend celebrated with the reserved but genuine warmth of people who had worked very hard for a very right thing. The 23 people from the holding facilities had all been safely placed, with assistance from the Deep Division and the House's own network, and 3 of them had sent notes through the official channels, careful and formal and deeply felt. And Rosalie read them in the operations room with the full weight of why she had run and why it had mattered, sitting precisely around her shoulders. Nikolai read them with her at her invitation. He was quiet afterward for a long moment. Your friend in Portland, he said. She is coming next week, Rosalie said. You offered the secure line 3 months ago. I used it. She is coming to meet you. He looked almost, for the first time in her acquaintance, nervous. She found this completely charming and did not tell him so. She is going to examine me with the specific critical attention of someone who loves you and is determining whether I deserve to, he said. Yes, Rosalie confirmed. And what have you told her about me? I told her you are 312 years old, white-haired, dangerous, extremely competent, and that you bring me tea and have been honest with me about everything, including the things that were uncomfortable to be honest about. And that I am happy, she said simply, because it was true, and she had learned from his example that simple, true things did not require ornamentation. He looked at her with the full, complete attention that she had once catalogued as observation and now recognized as something else entirely. Good, he said, and his voice was low and warm and absolutely certain. The friend from Portland came, and her name was Dara, and she was fiercely protective and sharp-minded, and looked Nikolai over with an assessment that was the human equivalent of his court's first evaluation of Rosalie, comprehensive and without apology. He bore it with composed dignity. Rosalie watched from across the room and thought that the 2 people she trusted most were working each other out, and felt the particular pleasure of 2 valued things meeting without collision, Dara cornered her in the library on the second day. "He looks at you," Dara said, "like you are the fixed point." "I know, and you look at him like you are not the least bit intimidated by 300 years of vampire prince." "I am sometimes a little intimidated," Rosalie said. "But I think that is healthy. He brought you tea this morning. He brings me tea every morning." Dara looked at her with the expression of a person revising a perspective. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I see it." "Good," Rosalie said, which was, she realized, the same word Nikolai had used, and she thought that there were worse things than beginning to echo the speech patterns of the person you loved on a cold January night, 4 months after the alley. 6 months after she had found the file and started running, Rosalie Rosenfeld stood in the underground garden of the court with Nikolai Gravesend and told him that she had made a decision. He waited. "I want to stay," she said, "not just in the court, not just in the work. I want to stay with you. I want to build something here that is mine as much as yours, that I have made by choice rather than fallen into by a blood vow." She looked at him, "And I want to have that conversation you offered me, about the longer term, about what it would mean and what it would require and what I would lose and gain. I want to have it now with full information, and I want to make the choice myself." He looked at her with everything he was, 3 centuries of history, and the court at his back, and the ancient vow running warm between them, and beneath all of it, the specific and personal love of a person who had been surprised by her in every meaningful way since a Tuesday night. "In November, we have time," he said, "as much of it as you need, to make the decision the right way, not under pressure, not because of the vow, not because of anything except what you actually want." "I know," she said. "I am not afraid of it." "I know you are not," he said, and there was such warmth in it, such precise and personal knowledge of who she was. She stepped toward him and he met her, and his arms came around her, with the complete and settled certainty of something that had found its right configuration, and she thought about the ancient vow and how it had activated without warning, and how she had been already holding him when it did. And she thought that perhaps the universe, in this instance, had gotten the timing exactly right. The vinculum marks on her wrist were warm and constant, and she understood them now not as a constraint or an imposition, but as the first honest thing in a long chain of honest things, the mark of a house that had sworn centuries ago to protect without taking, to bind without owning, to honor the humanity in those it sheltered, rather than make it secondary to its own nature. And she thought about Valderic and Mira, who had built 40 years of something entirely their own. And she thought that she intended to build considerably more than that. And she thought that Nikolai Gravesend was the most remarkable person she had encountered in her 23 years, which was saying something considerably smaller than his equivalent statement about her, and that the difference in what their superlatives encompassed made her smile every time she thought about it. "What are you smiling at?" he said against her hair. "Nothing," she said. "Everything, the specific absurdity of how we met." "An alley," he said. "You were bleeding, you caught me. I was not expecting to." "No," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "But you did." She tilted her head up to look at him, and he looked back, and the underground garden grew its determined dark leaves in the artificial light, and above them the city breathed in the cold January air, and the court of House Gravesend hummed with the work of people committed to a right and difficult thing, and the ancient vow rested warm and steady between them, not as a chain, but as a foundation, the oldest promise of the Gravesend line, made present and particular in this specific pair of people who had found each other in the best and least expected way. She kissed him, and he kissed her back, with 3 centuries of everything he was, and one very specific and new and extraordinary thing, and the story of how a human runaway had caught a vampire prince in a Chicago alley, settled into the shape of something that was going to last. All of it, she thought, had started with a burn beneath her sternum, unexpected and unbidden, like a coal pressed from the inside. She had learned since then that the most important fires started that way, not with ceremony, not with warning, but with the sudden irrevocable ignition of something that had been waiting in the dark for its moment, ancient and patient, and entirely certain of what it was. She was done running. She was exactly where the universe, and she herself, had decided she belonged.